Good evening. Warm welcome to you all for this fourth and final presentation in our fall term lecture series with the theme of making architecture. So early in the term, we had outstanding talks by Earl Briggs and Giles Hall on the CUHK Center for Chinese Opera. It's almost completed now in the West Kowloon Cultural District. And then we had Eric Howler from Harvard on the design works of his practice, Howler and Yu. And then most recently by Jamie Van Klemper, president of Kohn Pedersen Fox, on the commitment to craft in a highly successful commercial practice, KPF. So tonight we are privileged to listen to and learn from another highly regarded international architect, but one whose practice and teaching are very much locally based in Hong Kong. So that's our very own adjunct professor, Brian Anderson. He will share with us the evolutionary design process behind the complex conversion of the former Central Police Station and its adaptive reuse into a heritage and cultural center in the heart of our city. So as you all know, it's called Dai Gun, big station in Cantonese. Before introducing Brian more formally, permit me to share a few thoughts about design process and making architecture, the theme of our lecture series. So in our contemporary society, architecture, like everything else, tends to be immersed in a visual culture saturated by instant gratification. The experience and success of a project is reduced to one replicated image and how many likes it solicits. But at our School of Architecture, we're committed to the committed process of design, research, and practice, where the focus is less on what's first and more on what lasts. So for those of you who have taken the professional practice course with Bernard Lim, you will be aware of the HKIA work stages, A to F. Is that familiar to any of you? I see a few heads. And as outlined in the standard agreement published by Hong Kong Institute of Architects. And I'm sorry to say, for many professional firms, the design process ends after work stages A, B, C. And production takes over during work stages D, B, and F. So if you remember those work stages: submission plans to BD, working drawings, contract documents, and site supervision. But that is not what the best architecture firms believe or practice. In actual fact, each work stage, up to and including construction supervision, is a design stage, where the design details, materiality, and construction methods come together, are coordinated and integrated to translate design concepts into built reality. It is where design and technology must break even. It is still design, but those decisions now have bigger consequences. So tonight's speaker is not only an expert in heritage conservation, but an expert in making architecture. Brian Anderson was educated at South Bank University in London. He joined Purcell Miller Tritton in 1985, quickly became partner in the London office and stayed there until 2010, when he relocated to Hong Kong to head the Purcell office here. He has undertaken an extensive portfolio of architectural projects across a variety of sectors, but mostly in the area of heritage conservation. And a number of his projects have won design awards from RIBA, Civic Trust, and others. He has lectured at the Architectural Conservation Program at Hong Kong U. He has served as our external examiner at CUHK since 2013, and before joining us in 2017 as an adjunct professor. The title of tonight's lecture is From Central Police Station to Daegu? What role does adaptive reuse have in Hong Kong? So please join me to extend a warm welcome to our very own Professor Brian Anderson.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Nelson, and thank you all for coming. It's always a tremendous treat and a little bit of a relief when lots of people turn up to hear you speak. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming. This particular project, Nelson's already said a little bit about it, and I'll start with just elaborating a little bit more. Under the arrangement, under the joint venture partnership that our client, the Hong Kong Jockey Club, has with the government, the club gets to spend close to 4 billion Hong Kong, and in return for that considerable gift, gets to run this site on a not-for-profit basis for 10 years. As business models go, it's pretty unusual, I would say. And the stewards at the Jockey Club are always very quick to remind anyone who ever is listening of how generous they are. Of course, it's not quite that simple. It's actually the punters who pay for their betting slip every Wednesday night who are actually funding this. It's the proceeds of gambling. But it seems to me that this kind of project is a very good use for that money. And so here we are. We're spending a lot of money, and we're conserving a suite of existing buildings and building some new ones. And in terms of how we've gone about this, there are 3 architects involved on this project, which those of you who have been around as long as I have may say, well, that sounds like a recipe for disaster straight away. But in fact, it's been an extremely positive experience. I think I can speak for both ourselves, Purcell, but also Rocco Design Architects, who are the executive architects for this project, and of course Herzog de Meuron, who I'm sure you all know, they designed the 2 new buildings principally. And I think the reason why it worked well, and it is an important point to make for those of you who will be entering the profession in the near future, the idea of collaboration is getting stronger all the time in my experience. And it's something that we do need to embrace as a profession. I think the reason why it did work so well here is because two reasons really. One is we had a very complex fee agreement which set out the roles of each of us in a lot of detail. But more importantly, it was because of the particular skill sets that the 3 of us had. And it meant that there was never really a time when we were treading on each other's toes, never a time when we were competing for a particular element of the design development. There were the natural creative tensions that one would expect to see, but generally I felt that was a very positive experience. So do be aware of the idea of collaborative working with other architects. And do try to see it in a positive sort of way. So in terms of how we went forward, firstly I'll say a little bit about what we've delivered, and I've just very quickly summarised those. We end up with a modern art gallery. JC Contemporary is now its new name. A multi-purpose auditorium known as JCQ. We have live-work units for artists in residence, so if you're a sculptor or a poet or a songwriter or a fine artist, then you can rent some space in this building and go about your creative work. There will, in due course, we hope, be an art archive. There will be high-end arts-related shops. There'll be other retail, and there are food and beverage outlets. And the reason for that is to help the thing pay for itself. The basic model is that it breaks even for commercial uses, and the rent that they earn will offset the losses on the arts operations side. So that is ultimately what we've delivered. And we'll come back to the question about what role this kind of project has in Hong Kong a little bit later on. First of all, I'll say a little bit about the process that we've gone through. This is the front cover of the Conservation Management Plan that we first wrote in 2008. We were appointed in December 2007. We delivered this in June the following year. You may not have heard of a Conservation Management Plan before, and if that's the case, the thing to understand is that it's the report of a lot of archival research, but more importantly, it sets out all of the policy decisions related to strategic and detailed decisions that get made in the years following. I did mean to bring my copy of this document with me, not to take you through it by any means, but to show you the condition that it's in. The covers are now falling off, the pages are very dog-eared. That's not because we throw it around the room, it's because we use it. It's a most important tool when you're working on a project like this, that you understand why you're making the decisions that you're making. One of the policies, for example, resulted in the demolition of 3 of the 19 buildings on this site, and the reasons why that was the right thing to do. So it affects strategic decisions, it affects matters of detail as well, and it's a most useful document. It was helpful in terms of advocacy for the project. There was a fair amount of pushback from some people in Hong Kong. Politicians looking to throw their weight around will be very keen to criticise government and the jockey club simultaneously. A document like this is often very useful when it comes to pushing back against that where the criticism is not justified. So it's helpful in that regard as well, but also in dealing with other consultants and indeed our client who, for whom a project like this was quite new, and sometimes needed a helping hand towards the right solution. So this was a major piece of work that took us some 6 months. Very quickly, an overview of the site, and just to orientate you, Hollywood Road is here, Old Bailey Street here, Arbuthnot here, and Chancery Lane over here. This part is the police station compound. This is where the policeman works. This is the headquarters building. That's the officers' quarters there, barracks there, central magistracy here, and then the rest is the prison. It's a terribly, I think, terribly neat and tidy British sort of solution to law and order. You can imagine the policemen live here, they work here, they go out, they catch the criminals, bring them into court, if convicted, march them round the corner and into the prison. It's all terribly neat and tidy, and it's a sort of development that one would have seen in other parts of the UK in the 19th century. This is a view across the parade ground. Hollywood Road is just here. There's the barracks block, parade ground in front, and I'll say more about spaces later on. It's important that we recognise the value of space as well as buildings. Just to show you the same thing, but in plan form, Hollywood Road up here. The mid-levels escalator is just here. There's a dog leg just there to help you orientate. As you can see from this, 19 buildings originally. There's the 19th one just there. We've demolished this one, and this one, and this one, which I could go into another time. Prisons. Prisons were a reformist sort of thing to do in the UK. Before we really developed our prisons, we used to send our convicts to Australia, the other side of the world, just to get rid of them. But prisons were seen at various times as a form of reform. The idea that if you incarcerate someone, you protect them from the rest of the population, but it gives you an opportunity to make them into less bad people, or even into good people. and I'll come back to that later on. This is a prison, Wandsworth Prison in southwest London, and notice the form it takes. This cruciform plan was well established by the late 19th century, both in the UK and North America. And there were other examples of this around the place. And this was used as the model for the prison here. This building was actually built, this part of it still exists, but this was built, as you see, according to the same idea, whereby you'd have an inspection hall at the centre, and from there you could surveil along the axis of each of these ranges and maintain order. This is a late 19th century photo taken from the peak. Here you can see that cell block running back that way. And notice the ships in the harbour. Hong Kong was always about commerce, always about trade. It was about other things as well, but principally it was about trade. And the ships in the harbour is good evidence of that. We were very fortunate to have access to original design drawings. These date from the 1860s. They're kept at the Public Records Office in London, and we were able to examine these and make very good use of them. And what they showed was just how intact some of the buildings were. That's the officers' quarters that I mentioned before. This building is quite an interesting one. You might not think so architecturally. It's known as F Hall. It was originally not part of the prison at all, but the government printing works until it got bombed in the war. Then got rebuilt in 1956, and at that point became part of the prison. Its initial claim to fame is that it housed the Vietnamese boat people when they were landing on Hong Kong shores some years ago. However, we thought, well, 1956, it doesn't look that interesting, maybe we should demolish it. And this would create a nice space for one of Herzog's new buildings in that location. There was a big pushback from that partly because of this gate, the blue gate, called the blue gate because it's painted blue. The thing about it, yes, really. This is Old Bailey Street just here, Chancery Lane just here. The thing about the blue gate is that as a prisoner, if you were convicted elsewhere, you would enter this prison via this gate. Having served your sentence, you would exit the prison via this gate. Whilst you were in the prison, your friends and family visiting you, if you were lucky enough to have any, would enter and leave via the blue gate. Inside this building was a suite of interview booths where you would sit on a chair, just here, 1, 2, 3. You'd look through that screen, pick up the telephone, and speak to the inmate on the other side. The combination of this and the blue gate and the association with F4 gave this building very high social significance. And for that reason, we reversed our advice for demolition and kept the building after all. It's one of those things where we architects can easily overlook things that are really important to people. To say architecturally, the building wasn't really very special, but it had high social significance, and for that reason, we've kept it, and you'll see what we've done with it later. That's a view of the prison yard. Mango trees growing quite well there now, producing some fruit. And that's the prison yard at low level, quite stark, as you'd expect a prison yard to be. And we were quite keen to do our best to keep it that way. And you'll see later on the end result and see whether you agree. That's a view looking the other way, and the big white building there is that big cell block that I spoke about earlier. We had lots of this sort of thing to fix, and there's a whole other talk I could give about this sort of stuff, but I'm going to spare you that because I think there's more interesting things to look at. Back to this old cell block. big crack running right the way through there, 4 to 6 inches wide that crack is, and this part of the building would have fallen into a Buthnot road. This became unstable because of the building of the Centrium building just across the road and the basements of that building. That disturbed the geology, and this started to part company from the rest. So we then had to, well, they had already put in these high tensile wires that you can see here and here, big metal girdle around the building to keep it all together. What we had to do with Arab's help is to repair the buildings and then take the wires away, which we did. We also had lots of interiors like this, modern suspended ceilings put in, window aircon units, a lot of butchery of the joinery, which is most unfortunate. In the number 1 courtroom, this was an attempt at air conditioning, which we felt we really couldn't keep. And in the headquarters building, lots of this sort of thing, all added after the event. And servicing is one of the points that I want to talk about. The thing about servicing is that when these buildings were built, there was really no provision for servicing in anything approaching what we expect these days. There were no convenient service voids, vertical or horizontal, and you can see from the architecture that it doesn't lend itself to incorporating services. But what we had to do was to unpick all of that, but then to reinstall a new system that performed to a better standard, but much more discreetly. And how you do that is not easy. So I'll come back to that shortly. The other thing is that this site was conceived as a kind of fortress. It was like an island in the city, designed to keep people in. It was a prison, designed to keep people out. They didn't want intruders getting in there to make a nuisance. And it's surrounded by these massive revetment walls. The thing is that the walls are themselves important. It's not simply a case of demolishing them. So what to do about it? This diagram, courtesy of Herzog de Meuron's, shows the approach we took to this. We had some existing entrances, this one here, and one just here, but we created 2 new ones, and you'll probably know, instantly hands up, who's actually been to Dagon since it opened? Excellent, very good. Well, hopefully after this talk you'll want to go back, and if you haven't been, that you will want to go. That's part of the reason why I do this. So if you've been there, you'll know that there's a new bridge connection off the Emily, which is by far the most popular entry-exit point. There's also a new one here that comes up underneath the JC Contemporary building. And we felt that this was really important because whilst the fortress-like nature of the building is important, we wanted this to become not a sort of gated part of the city. We wanted it to be part of everyone's routine journey to work, that kind of thing. And so having this sort of movement through the site was a really important objective, and we spent a lot of time looking at that. This is the headquarters building on Hollywood Road, and then just looking slightly to the right, this is where the bridge is now, the new bridge connection. It actually connects, flies over Old Bailey Street and connects at that point just there. The bridge, incidentally, was as controversial as the rest of the project. This is an existing entrance, an extension of Possenger Street. Hollywood Road is just here, and Possenger Street is just behind us. We kept that. That's another entrance next to the magistracy, and then finally the other entrance, Balhenia House, just there. And I mentioned the cell block and the girdle that had been put around it. There is that girdle, painted blue, all of which we've now taken away. And this building is one of the 3 that we recommended for demolition. That has now gone, and you'll see what has replaced it shortly. services I mentioned and how to tackle them. I'm now going to show you very quickly a suite of plans and sections of one of the big cell blocks to show how we've tackled servicing in this particular building. So that's the plan showing the various spaces. This is the plan with the NVAC shown, then with the electrics, fire services, plumbing and drainage. It's an awful lot of stuff. What does that look like in cross-section? Okay, so there's the section unadorned, there's the MVAC, there's the electrics, fire services, and no plumbing and drainage for some reason. But anyway, the point is that what we try to do with this particular building is to arrange the services working with the geometry of the building that we're in. We're accepting that it's all on show, and we're trying to arrange it in a way that fits like a suite of furniture, if you like. And later on I'll show you what that looks like in reality. In one of the lesser cell blocks, a very straightforward solution here. We kept most of the original services. This is B Hall, which we didn't actually have a use for, so we've approached this as a conserve as found sort of solution. So we've made safe the electrics. We've had to redecorate because it was painted with lead-based paint. And we swept the floor and done little else to it. So this is as close as one can get to the cell blocks as they were when the last inmate left. In other spaces, we've taken a different view of this. We've, in the headquarters building, we've tried to keep the common areas as clean as possible. We've worked hard to limit the incursion into these set-piece spaces. Back to the main cell block, the one for which I showed the drawings just now, this is what it looks like in reality. So the main services all run through the centre and then tee off left and right into the spaces either side. This building is now an office building for the site operator. As you see, we've kept things like cell doors, but you can imagine the psychology of your office being an ex-prison is quite challenging. So we've worked quite hard with the lighting, selective use of bold colour, and made it environmentally pleasant, and the feedback we've had so far is, yeah, it's okay. And I showed you this before, and I haven't got an exact version of this currently, but that's just a bit of that same space. Basically what we've done here is to make use of what we already had. That suspended duct there wasn't really necessary because the building already had these ducts above the ceiling, and we simply made use of them. So we're feeding the supply air through those. Obviously, it's a little bit more expensive to do that. Back to the headquarters building. I showed you this just now, and that's more or less the same view today. As you see, we've stripped out everything we possibly could, and we've rerouted it in other areas, which I'll show you a glimpse of in a moment. And that's another view of the floor below. The question is, where do all those services go? Well, they go on the ceilings mainly in the adjacent spaces, and what we've done here is to simply put in some cloud ceilings, which hides most of it. It's not a perfect solution, but we have to put these things somewhere because there's an awful lot of it, and for the most part it's very bulky. Next thing to talk about is change. If you listen to the Antiquities and Monuments Office here, they will say, please keep it as small as possible, do as little as possible. That's their sort of standard solution for dealing with any historical building or site. If there's anyone from AMO here, by all means shout and scream at me, but it's a standard solution, sadly, because the way that you interpret historical buildings is not yet that well developed. There's still a long way to go, I think. So the concept of change is a real problem in Hong Kong. This is where the conservation management plan was useful. And along the way, I encouraged government to be a bit more open to the idea of change. After all, Hong Kong is the way it is, looking at it in its positives, because change was never an impediment. Just look out the window, look across Central, and you'll see what I mean. I mean, it's a place where change is just happening all the time. Maybe a bit too much, but anyway, the concept of change is important to address, and it's something that's always been with us. What I'm now going to do is show you a short map regression to show you how this site had changed over time before we did anything. So this is 1882, or 1852. This is 1856, 1866, 1887, 1901, 1914, 1936, 1961, so we've lost a few now, 2005, 2012, so we lost a bit more. So by the time we came on the scene, this is more or less what we had left. If I switch all the layers on, it looks like that. So that's a footprint of all the buildings that have ever existed on this site, both those still standing and those that had been built and have since been demolished. And I've shown this sequence of slides lots and lots of times to people, including those who were skeptics, those who were resistant to the idea of change, to get them used to the fact that change happens. And given that this site was now redundant, the need to address change was probably the single most important thing to consider. It also means that there's an awful lot of archaeology, and we dug up quite a bit of it. Looking at it in 3 dimensions, this is a photo courtesy of Pete Spurrier's book, Walking Guide to Hong Kong, which shows Governor Henry May, just here, doffing his hat. We think this is about 1910. The barracks building is just here. Parade ground, much narrower in those days. This was the headquarters at the time, just a simple mat shed. That tree still exists, as does that one, as does that gatepost, and that's still there too. So that's how it looked in around about 1910. That's how it looked about 2 years ago. And you can still see the gatepost, there's the mango tree. The mat shed is now gone and been replaced by a new headquarters building built in 1919. More on the barracks block, that's as it was when first constructed, 1862. And notice, incidentally, it's always good when you're looking at old photographs of buildings to look at other things. What's interesting about this is the fact that we've got European policemen in pith helmets in the front 2 rows. Then we've got Indian Sikhs behind them, and then Chinese coolies at the back and down the side. Now, socially, this is highly offensive. The idea that any organisation would allow this kind of stratification is just appalling. But this is as it was in those days. And for any of you who ever tune into UK TV, there's a very good series going on at the moment, narrated by Jeremy Paxman, who's a well-known UK journalist. It's called Empire. And he talks a lot about this kind of thing. And it's important that we architects understand this, because it says a lot about how the buildings were used and what the prevailing attitudes were at the time. It helps us to kind of get to grips with a site like this. And a photograph like that speaks volumes. So it's really important for that reason alone. That's more or less the same view now. And you'll see, just flip back, got 3 stories and then a roof on top. now we've got 4 stories. They were always short of space here, and so in 1906 they took the roof off and put this extra story on the top. It's rather ruined the proportions, but there we are. So change happens. This is the big cell block I mentioned. This bit still exists. That's now gone. This is known, unsurprisingly, as laundry yard. There's the washing hanging out there. You can see the prisoners parading around in a circle. There's the boiler house where they heated the water to wash the clothes. That had all gone, as had all of this. That had also gone. And was replaced by this building here, which, as I mentioned earlier, was one of those buildings that we recommended for demolition. So change happens. What to do next? Well, our approach was, in some respects, to leave things much as they were. In other respects, to make quite big changes. So here's an example of where we made no change. We simply repaired and redecorated the facade. And the same here. And the same here. And here. And here. This is the upper balcony of the Superintendents House. In other respects, we did a little bit more. This is the Sergeant's quarters. Hollywood Road is just here. Pottington Street is just below us. Early 20th century building, in quite a poor state of repair, but some rather nice, elegant cantilever verandas. We had to get that paint off, which was a big problem, and there's a whole other technical presentation I could do about how we did that, but we've now got this building back to the way it would have been originally. And this building and the one behind it is where the live-work units for the artists in residence are. So a little bit of a change there in terms of presentation and so on. Elsewhere we did slightly different things. This is the original entrance to the prison. This is where VIPs would have come in. Directly above our heads here is the Superintendents House. So this was the main way in. However, at some point, we don't know when, but this space got converted for use as a chapel. I mentioned earlier that prison was at one time seen as reformist. Arguably it still is. And part of that was religious worship, particularly Christian worship. So this got converted to a chapel. What happened was that this got blocked up. They placed the altar just there, and they sat in rows of chairs just here, and they redecorated the walls with this rather crude pattern. There's a slightly better view of it looking the other way. We found all of this under modern paint, and this is, believe it or not, in its restored state. This is as good as it gets. And you might say, well, why on earth would you keep that? Well, it's not for its artistic merit. The trompe l'oeil design, the window and the sort of rustic stonework is as crude as you can imagine. It's like someone's got a thick black marker pen and just kind of drawn it. It's really bad. This is not particularly significant artistically, but we've kept it because it's a physical manifestation of the idea of religious worship and the role that played in the management of the inmates. So sociologically, it's very important. Not artistically, not particularly historically, and certainly not architecturally, but in all its raw nature, it's a very important memory of the practice of managing prison at that time. Other changes are rather more significant. This is F4, the building I mentioned before. This upper part was where the Vietnamese boat people were housed. They were in there in 4 big cages. Each cage was held about 50 people in bunks. And at the corner of each cage they had 1 toilet. with a half door, so no privacy. But then I guess if you've been on the open sea in a small boat, that this was actually really rather good. Anyway, having decided to keep this building, we discovered that it was actually a really tough little building, and it's the only building that we were able to use for gallery use. We were asked by the Town Planning Board, when they were considering the application, whether we really needed the new buildings, and if we had 16 other buildings, for goodness sake, why can't we just convert them to gallery and auditorium and that sort of thing? And it was at this point that I got pushed to the front of the queue to respond to this, and I said, well, the thing is that these existing buildings, they have very light floor loads, they have ceiling heights maybe similar to this. You could adapt them for use as auditoria, as a modern art gallery, but you'd destroy the very thing that you're trying to save in doing so. So they went along with that, so that was okay. But this building was the exception. It had 6 metre or so story heights. It had strong concrete floors, able to cope with about 7 kVA. So it was a good building for gallery use. And one of Herzog's new buildings here, JC Contemporary, was built alongside. There was a little modern office block here we took away, and it connects through via bridges that connect the two through. So it's a good example of where we've used something existing, but we've expanded on that quite considerably to create this new building. That's a view looking across Old Bailey Street. The blue gate I mentioned earlier is just there. There's F Hall. That's the ablutions block where all the showers and toilets were for the constables who lived in here. And here's Herzog's new building hovering over the top. And that's a rendering of about 2012 looking from the prison yard. So quite a major intervention, and I can remember feeling at the time. I remember I come from the UK, where we're really quite conservative, it's fair to say, and feeling that this was, for me, this was quite challenging. But I'll say more about my reaction later on. And this is the parade, the prison yard with that major cell block. By now, it's lost quite a lot of its parts. There was a wing coming out this way, 2 more at 45 degrees, and then this end did extend originally down as far as Old Bailey Street, but this was damaged in the war. And this is how it looked by the time we arrived in 2010, looking really rather sorry for itself. It now looks like that. And apart from redecorating it, repairing it, what we've done is to open up these cells at this level. See the previous view. These were original colonnade which we reopened. And in there is one of the cafes. And this is a good example of where the CMP was important, because we were very clear that however attractive it might be to sit out here under a parasol maybe and enjoy and drink something, we had to hang on to the fact that this was the prison yard. I mentioned earlier how stark it was originally. And we've tried, and I'd be interested to hear your judgment, but we've tried to hang on to that so far as we could. So this is a new concrete paving, nothing more sophisticated than that. And the cafe in there is set behind that colonnade. That was a deliberate act to prevent the paraphernalia of the cafe extending out onto here. You might think, well, you're just being mean. Why wouldn't you allow people out here? The reason is that, as with the parade ground, as we'll see later, we're trying to reinforce the idea that the character of this space is something that matters. That, this isn't just another piazza somewhere in Hong Kong. This has a special kind of significance. This was a prison yard. and we wanted to retain as much of the fragments of that as we could. This is on a bus knot. We've now got rid of the brick sheds that used to be here, and we now have JCQ in its place. Archeology House on the corner, and the end of the big cell block just there. That's a view looking up the hill. Big cell block. The girder's now gone. We've repaired the crack. It's not fallen into our Buffmont Road, which is a big relief. So a major intervention in the site with both these buildings. And underneath that building, it looks like this. So this is the big cell block. We're now standing on laundry yard. You remember that with the washing lines. And this is the soffit of JCQ above. Just a few details. This is probably quite a good point to mention a bit more about the cladding. The cladding is cast aluminium made from recycled hubcaps from motor cars, apparently. It took a long time in the development. If I remember rightly, the moulds for this were made in Australia. The casting was done in Italy. It could have been the other way around, I forget. And then brought to Hong Kong. The inspiration for it was the pattern of the granite revetment walls, which I showed you some photographs of earlier. This was something that we knew all along. But as I mentioned before, I wasn't fully convinced myself that this was a good approach. But once the scaffolding came down, I have to tell you that suddenly, to me, it felt very contextual. And I didn't expect to come to that conclusion. It is quite a remarkable solution, and I've often wondered, I've not yet found out, and I'm sure Herzog and Miron will ever tell me, but I wonder whether they always had an idea about what this would look like at the end, and only released information to the rest of us kind of selectively, or whether they genuinely went on a voyage of discovery. We talk in studio, don't we, about architecture being a process of discovery, of exploration. Did that apply here? Or did they always know where they were going to end up and just kind of let us discover it for ourselves later on? I don't know. This is the Ablutions block that I mentioned earlier, and you can see JC Contemporary towering above it, just up the hill there. This building is outwardly much the same as it was originally, but the inside is gutted. This is a facade retention scheme, basically. In here we have the new electrical substation for the entire site. So the whole lot's been gutted, new concrete floors, new concrete walls, etc., and full of E&M. One of the bridge connections between a new and existing building. JC Contemporary again. Code compliance is something I want to quickly touch on. Nelson talked before about, in his introduction, about the process of design continuing beyond stage 3. Yes, absolutely right. The thing about these buildings is that they're full of what we call character-defining elements. This is a phrase that AMO has adopted from Canada. It's not a phrase that we think is terribly helpful, actually, but we have to work with it. By character-defining elements, what they mean is the things that make this building distinctive. In this case, the staircases are one such, and particularly the balustrades. The problem is that all the staircases break all the rules in the building code. So what to do? So we had to devise various ways of overcoming the problem. So that was before, that is now. We've got rid of the blue paint. The blue paint was post-1980. We've felt that that had to go. And we made some very subtle changes, which don't actually come out on the photograph. But these bars, here and here, are very slightly thicker than the other bars. I think this section was largely unaltered. The thing about the code compliance for these is the stairs were too steep, they were too narrow, the balustrades were too low, the gaps between the bars were too big, and the resistance to overturning was insufficient. Now we took the view that all of those, bar the last one, were manageable risks, except the resistance to overturning. If we all lean on the balustrade together, there's a risk it might overturn. The thing is, its strength or otherwise is invisible. You cannot tell until you lean on it whether or not it's going to fall over. So we, by and large, left the balustrades as they were, except for the resistance to overturning. And we met the code by just making these bars slightly thicker. So we spent a lot of effort. It took many months to get buildings department to agree to this. I think about 9 months it took, and quite a lot of money, a lot of fiddling around, and the result is that you can barely see the difference. This is the sort of thing we take a lot of pride in. That's a before, showing one of the corners. Not a terribly good way of turning the corner on the dam rail, incidentally. And we introduced an extra bar very simply to close down the gap. In other areas we did different things. Here we've got a balustrade that again breaks all the rules. The gaps between the bars are too big, it's too low, and it's not strong enough. Here we put in something that's very familiar to Hong Kongers, a cantilever glass balustrade with a lost edge top. And that does all the work of meeting the code requirements, and it means that when you look up from Hollywood Road at this, you can, in certain lighting conditions, get a reflection of the glass, but otherwise the intervention is invisible. And that's on the magistrate's building. Another solution where again we have the same problem. This is a light well, just here, goes down 2 stories. This is not strong enough, gaps are too big and so on. Here we simply put a grating in, so if you fall over that, you just land on the grating rather than fall 2 stories and break the neck. A little bit about how we communicate with builders is something that's really important with projects like this. You have to understand buildings from a builder's point of view. And you have to be able to communicate with builders in a way that they understand. This has been a big issue in the UK, and I dare say the rest of the world. And certainly when I began my career, it was normal for there to be misunderstandings, miscommunication, poor coordination of documents. The architect would draw his drawings, the engineer would produce his or hers, the QS would write a bill of quantities, and the 3 of them just never matched up. Well, they did match up occasionally, but not well enough. In the UK, we have the Building Research Establishment, as was. This is pretty damning. The BRE has blamed designers for 1/3 of all problems on site due to unclear or missing information. This is only 2009. It's not very long ago. This is dreadful. And as a profession, we need to be ensuring that we're not a party to this. There was an architect called Edwin Lutyens who lived a little while ago now, but he had a terribly straightforward view of all of this. He said production information, which I think we all understand, is a letter to the builder telling him what you want. It's as simple as that. It's an instruction. The thing about contractors is that they are by nature optimists. I don't think any contractor would be a contractor if they weren't. It seems to me that as a job, it's got far too many risks attached. Remember that the contractor's duty of care is rather higher than the architect's. If a building falls down, it's probably the contractor's responsibility rather than the architect. So for the contractor, it's a big deal. So being clear about what you want to do is really important. And there's also a point Luchin's made, I don't know that I agree with this necessarily, architects who don't know when to stop designing. We've probably all seen examples of overzealous design, but maybe that's just a matter of opinion. Anyway, we developed this in fairly recent years, which is basically built around the idea of proper coordination between drawings, bills of quantities, and specification. And I realise that for some of you this is a little early in your career to be told about this, but it's really important that we as a profession get to grips with this and take it on. And in no way does this frustrate our ambitions as designers. This actually makes us better designers if we can do this well. So in the UK, and I know we use the National Building Specification here quite a bit, we at Purcell certainly use it here, and it's built around this idea of coordinated project information. And it produces results. At Purcell, we've been using this for, I suppose about 20 years, and we've seen the number of mistakes go down considerably. What it looks like in practice is, here is the headquarters building at Daegun, and here is reference to a particular window on the plan, on the elevation. That is then cross-referenced to a schedule, which in turn is cross-referenced to a detailed drawing, and then to a specification of all the work illustrated on that drawing. So you can locate where the thing is, you can describe it, and you can quantify it. And when we first published these drawings, the QS here was amazed. He said, I've never seen anything like it. It was all so easy, he said. That didn't stop a few errors creeping into the bill later on, but as a process, it's robust, and it communicates what you as the designer want to give to the contractor. So, lastly, I'm just going to whiz through some nice photographs, at least I hope you think they're nice photographs. And I'll just say a bit about a few of them. Here and there we've made some quite bold interventions. This is a view north-south through the site where you can see we've cut a tunnel through successive buildings that are at right angles to the line of the tunnel. This gives a direct connection between the parade ground and JC Contemporary at the top of the site. It was, as I say, it's quite a bold intervention. We've been very straightforward about framing the opening, just using reinforced concrete, very, very simple. So there's no ambiguity about when this was done. In no sense could this be confused with having been done earlier. It's quite important, it's very important when you make an intervention in an existing building that it's of its time. It's the most important. The parade ground, I mentioned before with the prison yard, the importance of keeping the tables and chairs, the parasols at bay. Same applies here. We've just got some outdoor dining just here and here. This is a direct output from the Conservation Management Plan. At the time we published this, Knight and Frank, who were advising the Jockey Club, said, oh, this is ghastly. You know, we can cover this with 1,000 covers. We'd earn a fortune. Isn't this a good idea? And we said, no, it isn't. This is the parade ground. It's an important open space. Knight and Frank went away grumbling, but the club mercifully did agree with our view. Interestingly, on the opening night in May this year, there was a big light show here. We had dirigibles floating in, internally illuminated, all set to music, and it was all very, very interesting and lovely. And somebody on the project team looked at this and said, you know, we're going to have to animate this. You know, we're going to have to kind of keep doing this. And I thought, yes, absolutely. The thing is that if we were to use this for commercial purposes on a regular basis, that would frustrate doing something special with that space. And surely, particularly being in the middle of Central, having a fairly large flat space where you could do stuff that you couldn't do elsewhere is actually a really good thing. It's a challenge, but it's a really positive thing. That's a view from the barracks block looking down. Nighttime views. In Hong Kong, there's a tendency to overlight spaces. I live on the Kowloon side. Chim Chai Choi is probably brighter at night than it is in the day. There's just so much light, ghastly. In the UK, we tend to want to underlight our buildings, and that's the approach that we've taken here. And I'm pleased to say that from the outset, everyone was agreed on this. That's the new bridge connection going across Hollywood and Old Bailey Street. That's the parade ground at night, and as you can see, we've got lights on inside the buildings. We've got two lights, one there and one just there, that are throwing a bit of light onto that space. And part of the reason why those two lights are there is simply that historically there were two lanterns in that position, but that's all, no floodlighting. Up in the prison yard, again, we're relying largely on the lights within the buildings. We've got some street lights, as that is there, creating a pool of light, washing down over that facade, but relatively little. There'll be another one just outshot here that's creating this illumination on the ground. Another one of the prison yard, you can see the street light just there. And the reason that they're there is so you can find your way. That's really all they're for. Nothing on this side. And that's quite deliberate. The blue gate you've seen before, although it's drawn back in that shot. Another daytime shot showing JCQ just behind the tree there. And again. And the big cell block, the sun coming through the trees. It's all looking a bit pretty, I have to say. So it's not quite a prison yard. It's in Farratt's Lane between the back of the barracks just here and the revetment wall that forms the north boundary of the prison. So this is police compound. This is prison. When we arrived in 2010, there was a big barbed wire fence down the middle, lots of outbuildings and so on. We swept all of that away, and Herzog designed this little staircase that makes a direct connection to that, and some new bridges as well that enhance our means of escape arrangements. That's another one. New staircase again by Herzog. That's all Herzog in that picture. And that's the Superintendents House just there. That's an existing ramp. That's on the new stair just now. And just a close-up of the dining area in front of the headquarters building. And that is it. So in terms of what role can this sort of thing play in Hong Kong, I think the answer lies in gaining a better understanding of Hong Kong's history. I think it's created some interesting spaces that are quite different to anything else in Hong Kong. Certainly, judging by the number of visitors we've had, it's been a fantastic success. I think the stewards of the Jockey Club take a rather more hard-nosed view for us, and a tremendous privilege.